April 1945. Europe was in ruins. The thunder of war that had shaken the continent for nearly 6 years was fading into a hollow silence. Allied armies were closing in from every direction, American and British forces from the west, Soviet divisions from the east. Between them, the remnants of Hitler's once mighty army were disintegrating, scattered, starving, and leaderless. In the shattered streets of Cologne, Nuremberg, and the Rhineland, German soldiers, some barely more than boys, waited for an end they knew was inevitable. The Reich that had promised 1,000 years was collapsing after just 12. Smoke rose from bombed-out cities, and thousands of civilians wandered through the ruins, searching for food, shelter, or loved ones lost in the chaos. For many German soldiers, surrender was no longer shameful, it was survival. Rumors spread that Americans treated prisoners fairly, that they offered food and medical care instead of bullets. But others were haunted by Nazi propaganda, which had painted the Americans as brutal conquerors. Many didn't know what to believe. As the 9th U.S. Army pushed across the Rhine, entire German divisions began to give up without a fight. On muddy fields near the Ruhr Valley, hundreds of men laid down their weapons in silence, their faces pale with exhaustion. Some carried photographs of their families. Others simply stared blankly at the horizon. They were no longer fighting for the Führer. They were fighting against hunger, cold, and fear. American soldiers were astonished by the sheer number of prisoners. By the end of April, over 1 million German troops had surrendered to U.S. forces. There were so many that the Americans had to create temporary Rheinweisenlager, or Rhine meadow camps, vast open-air enclosures of barbed wire and mud, stretching for miles along the riverbanks. In these makeshift camps, men slept on the ground beneath the open sky. The nights were cold, the days damp with spring rain. Food was scarce and medical supplies were thin. Yet for most, the worst was over, the endless shelling, the terror of air raids, the constant retreat. Now they waited, uncertain of what would come next. Among them was Hans Becker, a 22-year-old mechanic from Hamburg. He had fought on the Western Front for nearly 2 years, repairing trucks and tanks for the Wehrmacht. When his unit was surrounded near Remagen, he surrendered without firing a shot. "I remember standing there," he later recalled, "hands above my head, and realizing the war was finished for me. I didn't feel fear, only relief. I wanted to live." Hans and his fellow prisoners were marched for days toward an American processing camp. Along the way, they passed through villages untouched by the bombing. The houses were still standing, the roads intact. For the first time, Hans saw American jeeps, radios, and endless convoys of supply trucks, machines unlike anything Germany could still produce. The Americans had gasoline, food, cigarettes, and fresh uniforms. It was as if the war had never touched them. To the captured Germans, it was a first glimpse of the industrial power that had crushed the Third Reich. By early May, Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen to the Soviets. German generals signed unconditional surrender on May 8, 1945. But for millions of prisoners, the war did not end with that signature. Their journey was only beginning. The Allies now faced a massive logistical challenge. What to do with millions of enemy soldiers? Britain and France took their share, but the largest number, over 370,000, were shipped across the Atlantic to camps in the United States. It was a plan that had begun quietly years earlier. The U.S. Army had prepared special facilities across the country, from Texas to Wisconsin, from Georgia to California, to hold and process prisoners of war. For men like Hans Becker, hearing they would be sent to America was almost unbelievable. "We thought they were joking," he said. "America was another world. We could not imagine being taken there." Yet within weeks, columns of captured soldiers were marched to ports like Le Havre and Cherbourg in France, loaded onto Liberty ships that had once carried tanks and ammunition in the opposite direction. Now those same ships carried the defeated enemy, tired, thin, and uncertain, across the ocean to the land they had been taught to hate. The voyage took about 2 weeks. The prisoners were given American rations, corned beef, bread, coffee, even chocolate. Many could hardly believe the abundance. For years, they had lived on black bread and watery soup. The taste of sugar felt almost unreal. At night, on the ship's deck, Hans would stare at the vast Atlantic and wonder what awaited them. Would they be punished, forced into labor, or would they simply disappear into some endless American prison? No one knew, but there was also a quiet sense of curiosity, even hope. Anything, they thought, must be better than the ruins of Germany. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the full extent of the destruction was becoming clear. Entire cities had vanished. Rail lines, bridges, and factories lay in rubble. Millions were homeless. For those still in uniform, the prospect of crossing the ocean began to seem like an escape from hunger, from chaos, from the ghosts of a lost war. As their ships approached the American coast, the prisoners gathered along the railings. Through the morning fog, the skyline of New York came into view, tall, glittering towers rising from the water. It was a sight none of them would ever forget. It was like a dream, Hans remembered. We had heard of America, but to see it, it was another world. They expected a nation hardened by war, scarred by bombing like Europe. Instead, they saw thriving cities, working factories, and endless trains carrying goods and people. Even in 1945, the United States seemed untouched, overflowing with life and movement. For the German prisoners, that first glimpse marked the beginning of a profound shock, one that would challenge everything they had been taught about the world and about themselves. They had left a broken continent behind. Now, they were stepping into the heart of an industrial giant, a land that had defeated them not only with weapons, but with sheer production, energy, and spirit. Their journey into America and into understanding had just begun. The gray morning sky over the French coast was filled with the hum of engines. On the docks of Le Havre, lines of weary German prisoners shuffled slowly toward the waiting ships. Their boots splashed in puddles left by the night's rain, their uniforms patched and faded, their faces expressionless. For many, it was the first time they had seen the ocean. For all, it was the beginning of a journey they could not imagine. Liberty ships stood ready, vessels that had once carried supplies to Europe for the Allied invasion. Now they would sail back across the Atlantic loaded not with tanks or ammunition, but with men who had worn the enemy's uniform. Painted gray and marked with bold white letters, the ships creaked against the tide. American soldiers, young and confident, stood on deck watching the long columns of prisoners below. Each man carried only what the army allowed: a small duffel, a blanket, perhaps a family photograph folded inside a pocket. Their weapons, badges, and ranks were gone. They were no longer soldiers of the Reich, they were POWs, property of the United States Army. When their names were checked and numbers recorded, they climbed the gangplank one by one. The metallic clang of boots on steel echoed like a slow drumbeat. Inside the ship, the air was heavy with the smell of oil, salt, and rust. The lower decks were lined with rows of bunks made from canvas and pipes, stacked 3 high. Every space was filled. Hans Becker found himself in the middle tier, squeezed between men from Bavaria and Saxony. Some spoke quietly, others said nothing. They were strangers, bound together by defeat. When the last prisoner boarded, the hatches were sealed. The deep whistle of the ship echoed across the harbor. As the engines roared to life, the vessel began to move. Slowly, the docks and cranes of France drifted away. The shoreline faded into the mist. For hours, the men stood at the railings, staring back at Europe. No one spoke. For many, It was not just a departure from a continent. It was the closing of an entire chapter of their lives. Once the ship reached open water, the sea stretched endlessly in every direction. The motion was rough. The first few days brought seasickness to many who had never sailed before. The smell of diesel mixed with salt water and the staleness of too many bodies in too small a space. Yet, despite the discomfort, there was an unspoken sense of relief. The war was behind them. No more air raids, no more artillery, no more death. Only uncertainty. Each morning, American guards distributed rations: canned corned beef, white bread, jam, and coffee. To the Germans, it was almost luxurious. They had grown used to thin soup and dry crusts. The first taste of real coffee in years made some close their eyes and sigh. Music drifted from the loudspeakers, American swing, cheerful and bright, the kind of rhythm forbidden in Nazi Germany. The prisoners listened in silence at first, but before long a few began tapping their feet. For the first time in years, there was laughter below deck. At night, Hans would lie awake, listening to the sound of the waves against the hull. He thought of home, his mother in Hamburg, his younger brother lost somewhere on the Eastern Front. He wondered if the city still stood. He had seen photographs of entire neighborhoods reduced to ash. Perhaps there was nothing left to return to. Days blurred together. On the fifth day, a storm rolled in. The ship groaned and pitched violently. Water crashed over the deck, soaking the men who tried to watch the waves. Buckets were passed through the lower decks as seasickness spread like wildfire. Yet even then, there was a strange calm. The storm, powerful as it was, felt small compared to the chaos they had left behind. During calmer hours, the guards spoke with the prisoners. Some Americans tried out their few words of German. Others shared cigarettes or chocolate bars. It was an odd, quiet camaraderie. Men who had faced each other across battlefields now sharing small talk about families and food. One guard, a farmer from Iowa, showed Hans a photo of his wife and children. "You'll like America," he said with a grin. "Plenty of food, big skies." Hans smiled politely, unsure if the man was mocking him. But there was no mockery in the soldier's eyes, only simple humanity. As the voyage continued, the prisoners began to form their own small routines. They cleaned the decks, wrote letters they hoped would one day reach home, and traded stories of their towns and families. Some still clung to pride in the Reich, insisting that Germany would rise again. Others spoke openly of their shame, of the crimes they had heard whispered about but never believed. One evening, a Red Cross officer held a short meeting on deck. He explained the rules that awaited them in America. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention, given food and medical care, and expected to work. "You are not our enemies now," he said. "You are our responsibility." The words struck many of the men deeply. For years they had been told that capture by the Allies meant torture or death. Instead, they were promised fairness. It was the first crack in the wall of propaganda that had surrounded them. On the 10th day, the ocean began to change color, from dark gray to deep blue, then finally to a brighter green as the coast of North America drew near. Excitement spread through the decks. Rumors flew. "We'll land in New York." "No, it's Virginia. They'll send us to Texas." At dawn, the fog lifted, and they saw it, the distant outline of the American coast. Some cheered quietly, others just stared in disbelief. As they drew closer, the shape of Statue of Liberty appeared through the mist, her torch glinting in the sunlight. Even the most hardened soldiers fell silent. For men who had grown up under totalitarian rule, the sight of that figure, symbol of freedom, was almost surreal. "I never thought I'd see America," Hans whispered, "and I never thought it would look like this." When the ship finally entered the harbor, they saw the skyline of New York rise before them. skyscrapers stretching higher than any building in Berlin, clean streets, ships and trains moving in perfect rhythm. There were no ruins, no smoke, no craters. The war had touched this country, but it had not broken it. The prisoners were lined up once more, processed and loaded onto trains bound for camps deep within the United States. Oklahoma, Nebraska, Illinois. As the train pulled away from the coast, Hans looked out the window at the passing landscape. Green fields, endless tracks, and towns alive with people who seemed untouched by war. It was a different world, a land of abundance and order. The journey across the Atlantic had carried them not only to another continent, but into another reality. They had left behind the ruins of a fallen empire. Ahead lay a country that had defeated them, not through terror, but through industry, unity, and sheer determination. None of them knew what awaited beyond the camp fences. But deep inside, a quiet understanding was beginning to grow. The world they had been told to despise might just be the one that would teach them how to live again. The train wheels clattered steadily across the American countryside. For the German prisoners packed inside, the rhythmic sound was strangely comforting. They had left behind the thunder of war, the crashing of bombs, the howl of sirens, and now only the even heartbeat of the rails remained. Through the narrow windows, they caught glimpses of a land that seemed impossibly vast. Endless green fields, barns painted red, long stretches of road where shiny cars rolled smoothly by. To men who had grown used to rubble and hunger, it felt like another planet. Hans Becker sat by the window, his face pressed against the glass. Every few miles he saw small towns, clean houses, children on bicycles, shop windows full of goods. "How can this be?" he whispered. "Didn't they say the war reached everyone?" For years, Nazi propaganda had painted America as a place of chaos and decay. Unemployment, poverty, racial strife. Yet here it was quiet, orderly, alive. Even the air felt different, heavy with the scent of cornfields instead of smoke and ash. The train stopped once in a small Midwestern town. American soldiers guarded the platforms, but locals gathered to watch. Curious faces, farmers, women, and children, stood at a distance, whispering among themselves. Some waved shyly. The prisoners were surprised. They expected hatred. Instead, they saw calm, even friendliness. One old man on the platform lifted his hat as the train passed. Hans nodded in return. "If this is our enemy," he thought, "then everything we were told was a lie." After 2 more days, the train finally arrived at Camp Concordia in Kansas, one of hundreds of POW camps scattered across the United States. The camp was surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers, yet it was nothing like the prisoners had feared. The barracks were wooden but clean, with bunks, blankets, and stoves for heat. There was a kitchen, an infirmary, even a small library. When the American sergeant in charge spoke to them, his words were translated by an interpreter. "You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. You will have food, shelter, and medical care. In return, you will work. There will be no mistreatment here, as long as you follow the rules." The men listened in silence, unsure if they could believe him. But as the days passed, they realized the promise was real. 3 meals a day, soap, clean clothes, medical attention. All things that had disappeared from their lives years ago. Hans was assigned to kitchen duty. For the first time in months, he held fresh bread in his hands, smelled real coffee, tasted meat that wasn't rationed. It felt almost indecent to eat so well while his homeland starved. Outside the camp fences stretched miles of farmland. Local farmers soon arrived with requests for workers. America's young men were still overseas, and labor was scarce. German prisoners filled the gap, picking crops, building fences, repairing machinery. When the first trucks left the camp carrying work crews, the prisoners were nervous. But on the farms, they met Americans who treated them not as enemies, but as workers, sometimes even as guests. Farmer families offered cold water, sometimes sandwiches. They spoke slowly, kindly, though most POWs knew little English. At lunchtime, they ate together under trees. Children were fascinated by the Germans' strange accents. The prisoners, in turn, were fascinated by the Americans' easy smiles. Hans worked on a wheat farm owned by a man named Robert Hayes. Hayes had lost his brother in France, but he didn't hold his anger against the men who worked his fields. "You're soldiers, same as he was," Hayes said one morning, handing Hans a bottle of lemonade. "The war's over now. Let's get the harvest in." Hans never forgot those words. He realized that the people around him were not the monsters described by Goebbels' propaganda. They were human, practical, and astonishingly forgiving. On weekends, the camp organized soccer matches. Sometimes American guards played alongside the prisoners. Music echoed through the barracks, accordions, harmonicas, and now and then, an American radio playing swing and jazz. The prisoners began to learn English words. Some even started writing letters to local families who had shown them kindness. Of course, not all POWs accepted this new reality easily. Among them were hardline Nazis who refused to believe their defeat was total. They whispered about revenge, about the new Germany that would one day rise again. But their voices grew quieter as months passed. The simple decency of life in America had begun to do what propaganda never could. It made men think for themselves. For Hans, the real shock came during a work trip to a nearby town. He was part of a small crew sent to repair a grain silo damaged by a storm. As they drove through the streets, he noticed something extraordinary. Stores overflowing with goods, tools, shoes, radios, even fruit and canned food. Ordinary Americans walked freely, unafraid, dressed neatly, smiling. He saw no bombed buildings, no blackouts, no shortages. There were cars everywhere, trains running on time, factories humming in the distance. The sheer scale of production overwhelmed him. This country could build forever, he thought. We never stood a chance. That night, back in the barracks, he wrote a note on scrap paper. "Now I understand why we lost. Not because they were stronger in battle, but because they were stronger in everything else." Even among the guards, the differences were striking. They were relaxed, confident, and joked with each other without fear. Orders were given firmly but without cruelty. The concept of authority was different here. It came from respect, not terror. Some prisoners began to talk about America as if it were a vision of the future. "If our country had been like this," one said, "perhaps there would have been no war." Months passed. Winter turned to spring, and the once skeptical Germans began to soften. The fences remained, but inside them, the fear had faded. In its place grew curiosity and, for some, admiration. Hans spent his evenings sketching. He drew the rolling fields, the tall silos, and the distant trains cutting through the horizon. One of the guards, a young man from Ohio, noticed his drawings and brought him a small notebook. "Keep these," he said. "Someday, you'll want to remember this place." Years later, Hans would say that notebook was the most precious thing he owned. In it were not just drawings, but lessons about freedom, dignity, and the power of a society that believed in both. The question that had begun on the train still echoed in his mind. What kind of country is this? Now he was beginning to find the answer. It was a nation built not on fear, but on possibility. A place where even an enemy could be treated as a man. And for those who had come from the ruins of a dictatorship, that realization was more powerful than any weapon. The mornings at Camp Concordia began with the sound of a whistle. It was sharp and brief, cutting through the soft Kansas dawn. Within minutes, the barracks came alive. Boots scraping the floor, murmured greetings, the creak of wooden bunks. The prisoners rose, washed, and lined up outside for roll call. Beyond the barbed wire, the prairie stretched endlessly, golden and silent. The camp itself was organized with almost military precision. Rows of identical huts, watchtowers at the corners, gravel paths dividing the blocks. Yet, to the surprise of many, it was far from the grim prisons they had imagined. The guards were mostly young Americans, some barely older than the prisoners themselves. They carried rifles, yes, but their posture was casual, their tone relaxed. Orders were given firmly, but without cruelty. Discipline without hatred. That's how one POW later described it. Breakfast was served in long mess halls. Oatmeal, bread, and sometimes eggs or bacon. For men who had endured starvation in Europe, the abundance bordered on surreal. "They feed us better than our own army did," one prisoner joked, and laughter rippled down the line. Inside the fences, daily life soon fell into rhythm. After morning roll call and breakfast, work crews departed, some to nearby farms, others to build roads or repair local infrastructure. Those who remained in camp took up duties in kitchens, workshops, or medical stations. Hans Becker, now trusted with more responsibility, worked as a mechanic. The Americans quickly realized the Germans were skilled, disciplined workers. Under Hans's supervision, they repaired trucks and tractors for local use. Tools, parts, and engines fascinated him. Everything seemed newer, better designed, and made to last. "Even their wrenches are stronger than ours," he noted in his small notebook. When the day's labor ended, the camp transformed into a small, self-contained village. Inside the barracks, men played cards, wrote letters, and read books supplied by the Red Cross. There were classes in English, mathematics, even philosophy. A few prisoners taught one another engineering and art. Others formed small orchestras, crafting instruments from scraps of wood and wire. On Sundays, the camp chapel filled with quiet hymns sung in German. An American chaplain presided, speaking slowly and kindly. Religion, long manipulated by propaganda, began to feel genuine again, a comfort rather than a tool of the state. The fences remained, but within them, a strange sense of normalcy grew. The men began to rediscover something they had almost forgotten: dignity. Letters from home arrived once or twice a month, censored but precious. Many wrote back carefully, hiding their gratitude to avoid trouble for their families under occupation. Some received news that their cities were gone, families scattered. Others learned that loved ones were alive, rebuilding. Each evening, as the sun sank over the plains, prisoners would gather by the fence, watching the horizon turn crimson. On the other side, American guards sometimes stood doing the same. They rarely spoke, yet there was a quiet understanding between them. Men separated by war, united by fatigue. Occasionally, tension flared. Not all prisoners accepted their defeat. Among them were die-hard Nazis who formed secret groups, trying to enforce party discipline inside the camp. They called themselves Die Schwarzen, the Blacks, and used threats to silence anyone they considered traitors. One night, a rumor spread that a prisoner had been beaten for praising the Americans. The camp command acted swiftly. The ringleaders were isolated, their privileges revoked. For most, it was a relief. "We were tired of living in fear, even among our own," Hans recalled. "It was the first time I felt truly free, inside a prison." That paradox defined life in the camps. The fences that confined them also protected them. From hatred, from ideology, from the chaos of a ruined homeland. In time, the Americans allowed small gestures of trust. Work details outside the wire increased. Some prisoners were permitted to visit local fairs under supervision. There are records of German musicians playing for American audiences in nearby towns. Awkward at first, but soon warmly received. Children from those towns would wave as trucks carrying POWs passed by. The prisoners waved back, smiling, sometimes tossing small wooden toys they had carved during spare hours. The U.S. Army encouraged cultural programs, believing that exposure to democracy and freedom would reshape the prisoners' minds. They called it re-education, though it rarely felt forced. Films were shown, American newsreels, documentaries about the war, and even Charlie Chaplin comedies. For many Germans, it was their first glimpse of uncensored media. When the great dictator was screened, the laughter in the hall was uneasy at first, then louder, freer. "We laughed at ourselves," Hans wrote later, and that was when something began to heal. By 1945's end, daily life inside the camps had become remarkably organized. Prisoners published small newsletters, wrote poetry, and staged theater performances. One camp even built a replica of a German town square for a play. There were debates about politics, art, and the future of Germany. The Americans watched with cautious respect. These were not the same men who had surrendered months earlier. The arrogance and blind obedience that had fueled the Reich were fading, replaced by introspection and a dawning admiration for the very nation that had defeated them. Still, homesickness lingered. Every night, men dreamt of Germany. The smell of pine forests, the sound of their mother tongue, the faces of those they had left behind. Freedom in captivity could never replace home. In early 1946, a rumor spread that some would soon be repatriated. Excitement mixed with fear. What awaited them in the ruins of their homeland? Would they be seen as villains or as survivors? On his last evening in Camp Concordia, Hans walked once more along the fence. Beyond it, he could see the American flag fluttering in the warm wind. Behind him, his comrades sang quietly, their voices blending with the hum of crickets. He realized that, inside these fences, he had found something unexpected. Not punishment, but perspective. America had not only fed and housed them, it had shown them a different way to live. Discipline without cruelty, strength without oppression, freedom without chaos. As he turned to leave the yard, Hans touched the fence with his hand. The barbed wire was cold beneath his fingers. "I came here as a prisoner," he thought, "but I am leaving as something else." The winter of 1945 melted slowly into spring. Across the American plains, fields that had lain frozen for months were stirring again. Tractors coughed to life, seeds were planted, and the hum of work filled the air. But the hands that turned the soil that year were not all American. They were German. Behind the fences of hundreds of POW camps, the U.S. Army faced a practical problem: millions of able-bodied men doing nothing while American farms and factories faced severe labor shortages. Most young Americans were still overseas, fighting or demobilizing. Food was needed: wheat, corn, cotton, fruit. Someone had to harvest it. So, under the Geneva Convention, the War Department began assigning prisoners to agricultural work. For the German POWs, it meant a strange kind of freedom, the chance to leave the camp each morning and see the vastness of the country they had once been taught to despise. At Camp Concordia, Hans Becker's name appeared on the list for external labor detail. He was assigned to a wheat farm near Salina, Kansas. When the trucks rolled out before sunrise, he watched the fences disappear behind him and felt a rush of air that smelled of open earth. It was the first time in years he had traveled without fear. The farm belonged to Robert Hayes, the same man Hans had met during his early days in America. Hayes greeted the men politely, not as enemies, but as workers. "We start early," he said, handing them gloves and hats. "Sun gets hot by noon." The work was hard. Long days of planting, harvesting, and fixing machinery, but there was dignity in it. Hans repaired a broken thresher, surprising Hayes with his mechanical skill. Soon the American trusted him to manage other tasks alone. At lunch, they sat under a cottonwood tree, sharing sandwiches and lemonade. Words were few, but gestures spoke enough. The prisoners earned 80 cents a day, half kept by the army, half in camp credit. They could buy soap, writing paper, or, most treasured of all, cigarettes. For many, the work became a welcome rhythm, something that made time pass faster and brought a sense of purpose back to their lives. Everywhere across the Midwest, the same scenes unfolded. In Texas, German prisoners picked cotton under the blazing sun. In Wisconsin, they chopped timber. In California, they tended orchards heavy with fruit. The local newspapers called it the quiet workforce, and many farmers later admitted the Germans had saved their harvests. Some communities were wary at first. Rumors spread, "Nazis are working on the farm down the road," but fear quickly gave way to familiarity. The prisoners were well-mannered, disciplined, and grateful for kindness. Children would peek from behind fences to watch them work, sometimes shyly waving. A few weeks later, they'd be bringing water or apples to share. The lines between captor and captive began to blur. Many farmers saw the young Germans not as soldiers, but as boys far from home. "They were just like our own sons," one woman later recalled. "They worked, they laughed, they missed their mothers." Hans soon learned simple English phrases. "Good morning," "Thank you," "Fix tractor." Hayes, in turn, tried a few German words. They communicated through tools, gestures, and shared labor. When the harvest came, they celebrated together with cold beer and fresh bread baked by Hayes's wife, Martha. She served them under the shade of the porch, the stars beginning to appear above the fields. That night, Hans wrote in his notebook, "Today I ate with Americans. I thought of my father's warnings of propaganda posters showing monsters. But these people are not monsters. They are workers like us. Perhaps they have always been." Back at camp, the returning trucks were filled with laughter and songs. Work had changed the men. They were stronger, calmer, more confident. The fences now seemed less like a prison and more like a border between two worlds, one they were beginning to understand. Not every experience was easy. Some guards distrusted the prisoners, watching them closely. A few farmers refused to employ the enemy. There were rare escapes, most ending within days, the fugitives turning themselves in, exhausted and hungry. "Where would we go?" one of them later said. Germany was farther away than the stars. Still, cooperation grew. Local stores began selling small items to the camps. American families sent books and magazines. On Sundays, POW orchestras performed for visitors. In some towns, German choirs sang at church services, their voices blending with the congregation's hymns. The Red Cross inspected regularly, ensuring the men were treated fairly. Reports praised the camps for their humane conditions, though they also noted the psychological toll: loneliness, guilt, uncertainty about the future. Many wondered if they would ever see their homes again. Hans often thought of Hamburg, the city he had left behind. Letters came slowly, sometimes months apart. One brought good news: his mother was alive. Another, darker one, told of his brother's death on the Eastern Front. Hans folded that letter carefully and kept it in his pocket for weeks. Work became his refuge, his way of not thinking too much. In late summer, a tornado tore through part of the county, flattening barns and scattering equipment. The next morning, dozens of prisoners volunteered to help rebuild. They worked beside Americans for days, hammering, lifting, clearing debris. No one asked them to. They simply did it. When it was done, the local newspaper printed a photograph. German POWs standing shoulder to shoulder with Kansas farmers, smiling wearily beneath a bright sky. It was a small moment, easily forgotten in the vast history of war, but for those who lived it, it meant everything. By the end of 1945, over 425,000 German prisoners were spread across 500 camps in the United States. They harvested crops, built roads, repaired rail lines, and even helped process food for soldiers still fighting in the Pacific. Their labor quietly sustained the American home front. When news came that the war in Europe had ended, the prisoners cheered, then fell silent. Victory meant peace, but also the end of their strange, suspended life in America. Repatriation would come, but slowly. Some would wait months, even years, before seeing home again. For Hans, that news was bittersweet. The farm had become a place of healing. He would miss the open fields, the scent of wheat, the sound of engines running smoothly under his hands. On his final day at the Hayes farm, Martha pressed a small parcel into his hands, a piece of bread wrapped in a cloth, and a photograph of the family standing by the barn. "To remember," she said softly. Hans nodded, unable to speak. He had no gift to give in return, only words. "Thank you for treating us like men." When the truck drove away, he looked back one last time. The farmhouse grew smaller, the fields stretching endlessly behind it. Those same hands that once loaded rifles had now built fences, fixed tractors, and brought in harvests. They had fed the country that defeated them, and in doing so, they had begun to reclaim something of their own humanity. The first time Hans Becker saw an American factory, he thought he was looking at something out of science fiction. It was the summer of 1945. The war in Europe had ended, but for thousands of German prisoners still held in the United States, life continued in a strange limbo. They were no longer enemies, but they weren't free either. To keep them busy, the U.S. Army began sending skilled workers to assist in non-military industries, construction, repairs, food processing, and machine work. Hans, with his mechanical background, was assigned to a repair facility near Wichita, Kansas. What he saw there would forever change how he understood power, not the kind measured in guns or armies, but the kind that builds, creates, and sustains. The factory floor stretched farther than his eyes could follow. Overhead, cranes moved giant engines with smooth precision. Belts and pulleys whirred. Sparks flew from welders' torches, and everywhere there was movement. Fast, efficient, coordinated. Hundreds of men and women worked side by side, their rhythm guided by the hum of machines. For Hans, it was a revelation. He had worked in German factories before the war. Dark, noisy places where orders were shouted and discipline was enforced with fear. But this was different. The workers here laughed, talked, even sang to the radio while they worked. Supervisors moved among them, not as tyrants, but as equals. He could hardly believe it. These people had achieved a level of productivity beyond anything he had imagined, and they had done it without the whip of terror or the slogans of ideology. At lunch, an American foreman named Bill Carver sat beside him. Carver was in his 40s, with grease-stained hands and a friendly grin. "You worked machines back home, didn't you?" he asked.
Hans nodded courteously.
Carver passed him a sandwich. "Well, then you'll appreciate this. See that press over there? It turns out more parts in one day than your old factories probably did in a week." Hans studied the machine, a massive hydraulic press gleaming under the factory lights. He couldn't argue. The scale of American industry was overwhelming. After work, as the truck carried the prisoners back to camp, Hans and his comrades spoke in low, astonished voices. They talked about the endless rows of trucks on the highways, the trains that never stopped, the fields of grain that seemed to feed entire nations. One man said, "Now I understand how we lost the war. It wasn't just their soldiers. It was this." And he was right. Behind the front lines, America had achieved something the Germans never could: a union between freedom and efficiency. Factories operated 24 hours a day, powered not by fear, but by purpose. Women filled the assembly lines, driving rivets into the wings of aircraft and assembling engines with pride. Posters on the walls read, "We can do it," a slogan that was more than propaganda. It was a reflection of a national spirit. For the prisoners, it was a stunning contrast to what they had been taught. Nazi propaganda had painted America as a lazy, chaotic land ruled by greedy businessmen and selfish citizens. Yet here, the system worked with astonishing harmony. As weeks passed, Hans began to see more of it. He was sent to different facilities, grain silos, railroad yards, and even an automobile plant being converted for postwar production. Everywhere, he found the same pattern: order without oppression, discipline without cruelty, and power without fear. One day, standing outside a rail depot, he watched a line of locomotives thunder past. Brand new machines, black and silver, bound for distant cities. He counted them: 1, 2, 3, 20 in total. "Each one of those," said the American guard beside him, "can haul 1,000 tons across the country, coast to coast." Hans felt a chill. In Germany, fuel shortages and bombings had crippled their railways years before the war's end. Here, the trains seemed endless, unstoppable, a symbol of a nation that never ran out of motion. At night, back in camp, he tried to put his thoughts into words. "I believe Germany was the heart of progress," he wrote in his notebook. "But America is the body, the hands, the lungs, the muscles. It builds without boasting. It simply works." Other prisoners felt the same. Discussions filled the barracks. How had a democracy managed to produce such might? How could ordinary citizens, factory workers, farmers, truck drivers, achieve more than a regimented empire? The answers were not simple, but they were visible everywhere. The Americans worked for themselves, not for a dictator. Their motivation was personal pride, not fear of punishment. And it showed in every spark of the welding torch, every perfectly cut piece of steel. Some prisoners grew quiet, reflecting on what this meant for their homeland. "If we had built like this instead of destroying," one said, "maybe we would have conquered the world, but in a better way." Hans thought often of his father's generation, proud and bitter, always looking backward to the old empire. Now he saw another path, the path of creation, not conquest. As summer deepened, the industrial machine around them shifted from war production to peace. Airplane plants began retooling for commercial aviation. Factories that once built tanks now produced tractors and trucks. America was already preparing for the world beyond war, while Europe still smoldered in ruins. One afternoon, Hans and his crew were taken to a dam construction site in Oklahoma. The scale of it defied imagination. Concrete towers rising from the riverbed, cranes swinging massive slabs into place, the roar of engines echoing off canyon walls. The foreman explained that the dam would power thousands of homes. Hans stood there, feeling small beneath the vast structure. This, he realized, was real power, the power to light cities, irrigate fields, and give life. It was then that he understood why so many Americans seemed unafraid of the future. They were building it, one rivet, one engine, one dam at a time. By the time the prisoners were ordered back to camp that evening, the sun was setting behind the scaffolding. The sky burned orange, the air thick with dust and the smell of diesel. Hans turned for one last look at the dam, still under construction but already magnificent. He whispered to himself, "We built weapons. They build worlds." That night he could not sleep. The images of the factory lines, the endless trains, The glowing furnaces all burned in his mind. He imagined a Germany rebuilt in that image, not ruled by fear, but driven by ingenuity and will. Months later, when repatriation orders finally came, Hans knew that what he had witnessed would stay with him forever. The war had stripped him of faith in his country's leadership, but America had given him something new: faith in human ability. Years later, he would return to Germany and help rebuild his hometown, working in a factory that produced tractors for Europe's recovering farms. Whenever someone asked where he learned his methods, he would smile and say, "In a place far from home, where I was once a prisoner, but learned what freedom can build." When the guns of war finally fell silent, another battle began inside the fences, not a fight of weapons, but of ideas. For years, men like Hans Becker had been raised on a steady diet of propaganda. From childhood, their teachers, radios, and newspapers told them that Germany was the superior nation, destined to rule. They were taught that democracy was weak, that freedom bred chaos, and that Americans were lazy, materialistic, and divided. But life in the United States, the fields, the factories, the faces, had begun to chip away at those beliefs. Each passing month in captivity felt less like punishment and more like awakening. It started quietly. A conversation here, a newspaper there, a film screened in the camp recreation hall. The U.S. authorities called it re-education. To many prisoners, the word sounded suspicious at first. They had been educated too many times before, always for someone else's purpose. Yet what they encountered in America was different. There were no forced lectures, no shouting slogans, no demand to confess guilt. Instead, the Americans simply showed them things. They were allowed to read Life magazine and local newspapers, to see photographs of the war's aftermath, the liberation of camps, and the rebuilding of Europe. They read editorials debating politics openly, something unthinkable back home. They saw a society where disagreement was not punished but printed. At first, disbelief filled the barracks. "They let people criticize the president?" someone asked. "And they're not arrested?" The guards only laughed. "That's how democracy works," one replied. Soon, debates erupted among the prisoners themselves. Around wooden tables in the evenings, groups formed, some clinging to the old beliefs, others cautiously exploring new ones. The camp became a miniature parliament, alive with arguments. Hans often joined these discussions. He listened more than he spoke, weighing every word. He had seen enough of both worlds now, the obedience of the Reich and the openness of America. And for the first time in his life, he was beginning to think for himself. One evening, an American chaplain named Father O'Donnell visited the camp. Instead of preaching, he asked questions. "What do you think freedom means? What makes a good society?" First, silence. Then a young prisoner said, "Freedom means doing what you want." O'Donnell smiled gently. "No," he said, "it means having choices and taking responsibility for them." That conversation stayed with Hans for days. In Germany, choice had been a luxury. Orders came from above. Obedience was survival. Here, responsibility was shared, from the lowest worker to the highest official. In the weeks that followed, the camp library became one of the busiest places. Prisoners borrowed English textbooks, political essays, and classic novels. They devoured the Federalist Papers, Steinbeck's Of Mice and Men, even Mark Twain. Through those pages, they discovered an idea of America far more complex and human than propaganda had ever shown. Music, too, played its part. American jazz crackled from radios in the recreation hall, strange, lively rhythms that broke every rule of German order. At first, it sounded chaotic. Later, liberating. Some prisoners began to tap their feet, then dance, laughing like schoolboys rediscovering joy. It was during one of those evenings that Hans realized how much he had changed. Months earlier, he might have mocked such music as degenerate. Now, he saw in it a kind of freedom that no dictatorship could ever produce, creativity born from diversity, harmony found in improvisation. Still, not everyone welcomed the change. In every camp, there were small groups of hardliners, men who clung to the past, who whispered that the Führer still lived, that Germany would rise again. They painted swastikas on the Baroque walls, held secret meetings, and called others traitors. When one of them threatened a fellow prisoner for attending an American organized discussion group, Hans finally spoke out. "The war is over," he said firmly. "We lost. But that doesn't mean everything we believed in was true." It was a dangerous stance, but others nodded. The old fear was losing its hold. The transformation was not orchestrated. It happened naturally, through daily exposure to a different kind of world. The simple fairness of the guards, the kindness of American farmers, the sight of free newspapers and independent churches, all these things carried more weight than any lecture ever could. By late 1945, the change was visible even to the Americans. A U.S. report noted, "Many German prisoners now express admiration for democratic processes. They are beginning to see discipline as cooperation rather than domination." Some camps began publishing small German-language newsletters. Hans joined one as a translator. They printed essays, short stories, and letters about rebuilding Germany, about what freedom might mean after dictatorship. He wrote one article himself, titled "A Strong Nation Needs Free Men." It was signed simply HB. When the paper circulated through the camp, a few old loyalists tore it down. But many others folded it carefully and kept it. Outside the fences, America was already changing too. Soldiers returned home, factories shifted to peacetime production, and a sense of optimism spread. The prisoners watched all this with fascination. The same country that had spent years at war was now turning its energy toward building houses, schools, new lives. It was a living lesson in resilience. One Sunday, the camp was visited by a local college professor who offered a public lecture on the U.S. Constitution. He spoke of checks and balances, of individual rights, of the rule of law. The prisoners listened intently. When he finished, Hans raised his hand. "In our country," he said quietly, "we had laws too, but they changed when the leaders wanted them to." The professor nodded. "Then perhaps the true measure of freedom," he said, "is when the law protects the people from the leaders, not the other way around." That idea struck Hans like lightning. It was simple, yet it explained everything. Weeks turned into months, and news from home grew more frequent. Germany lay in ruins, cities flattened, millions displaced. But within the letters that trickled in, there was also talk of new beginnings. Elections, reconstruction, aid. The word democracy appeared more often now, tentative but hopeful. When repatriation orders finally came, Hans and his comrades lined up by the gate. The American flag fluttered above them in the morning wind. As each man stepped forward to board the transport truck, he received a small packet, documents, some rations, and a booklet titled "Your Role in Germany's Future." Inside were simple words: "What you have seen here, fairness, cooperation, freedom, these are not gifts. They are responsibilities. Carry them with you." Hans read the line again and again during the long voyage home. Months later, back in Germany, he found himself standing amid the rubble of Hamburg. Children played where houses had once stood. His mother, older and thinner, greeted him with tears and laughter. He began work in a small workshop, rebuilding engines and teaching apprentices what he had learned in America. Not just about machines, but about trust, teamwork, and dignity. When he spoke of his time in the United States, he didn't talk about fences or guards. He talked about books, music, and the simple kindness of strangers. And when one of his apprentices asked, "Did you really see democracy?" Hans smiled softly and replied, "Yes, I saw it not in speeches or parades, but in how people treated each other." The morning the orders came, the camp was unusually quiet. For months, rumors had drifted through the barracks, whispers that soon they would be going home. No one truly believed it, not until the American officer stood before them, papers in hand, and read the list of names. "Repatriation begins next week," he said. "You'll be returning to Germany." A murmur ran through the crowd. Joy, disbelief, fear. For some, home was a word that no longer had meaning. For others, it was the only word that had kept them alive. Hans Becker stood still, the name of his homeland echoing in his mind. Germany. After years behind fences, he would finally see it again. But what kind of country would be waiting? The next days passed in a blur of preparation. Prisoners packed their few belongings, letters, photographs, small carvings made during captivity. Some left gifts behind for the guards who had treated them kindly. Others wrote thank you notes to the American families who had sent food, books, or smiles. When the trucks arrived, the men climbed aboard, waving at the camp one last time. The fences glimmered in the sun, and beyond them, the American flag fluttered gently in the wind. For Hans, the sight carried no resentment, only gratitude. Behind those fences, he had discovered a new kind of strength. Not the power of domination, but the power of understanding. The convoy drove through the heart of the country, past golden fields and busy towns. Everywhere, America was alive, thriving, rebuilding, moving forward. Gas stations, new cars, fresh paint on every storefront. It was a vision of what civilization could be when it chose creation over destruction. The prisoners traveled east, their journey stretching over days and then weeks. They boarded trains that rattled through the mountains, then ships waiting in crowded harbors. The Atlantic, gray and endless, opened before them, the same ocean they had crossed years ago as prisoners. But this time they were no longer captives. They were witnesses. The voyage was long and cold. On the ship's deck, Hans watched the horizon, remembering faces and moments. The Kansas farmer who had treated him like a man, the jazz music echoing in the camp, the vast factories that had redefined his idea of power. He wondered what awaited him now, beyond the water and the ruins. After nearly 2 weeks at sea, the ship reached Europe, not Germany, but France. The prisoners were handed over to French and British authorities for processing. The Americans had done their duty. Now, the final leg of the journey would be handled by the Allies. For some, it was a bitter transition. The conditions in Europe were harsher, the food scarcer, the tempers shorter. The continent still bled from its wounds. Cities lay in rubble, railways twisted, and families displaced. Finally, months after leaving the United States, Hans stepped off a train in Bremen. It was raining, a steady drizzle that blurred the outlines of the bombed-out station. Smoke rose from piles of debris. The air smelled of wet stone and coal dust. This was home, Germany, or what was left of it. He walked through streets that no longer had names, past hollow buildings like skeletons of memories. Where once there had been cafes and schools, there were now walls cracked open to the sky. Children played in the ruins with sticks for toys. Women carried buckets of water from distant wells. Men in tattered coats searched the rubble for bricks to rebuild. It was a silence different from the one in the American camps. Not peaceful, but empty. Hans found his way to Hamburg, his birthplace. The train ride north took him past miles of destruction. At every stop, people climbed aboard, their faces drawn and pale, their eyes haunted. Some carried small bundles of belongings. Others had nothing at all. When he arrived, the city was barely recognizable. The great port, once bustling with ships, was choked with wreckage. Whole districts had vanished, replaced by fields of brick and ash. Yet, amid the devastation, life persisted. Smoke curled from makeshift chimneys. The sound of hammers echoed in the distance, fragile signs of renewal. He searched for his mother for days, following addresses that no longer existed. Finally, in a small rebuilt shelter near Altena, he found her. She was thinner, older, her hair streaked with gray. When she saw him, she froze, then ran forward and held him tightly, as if afraid he might vanish again. For a long time, neither spoke. When words finally came, they were simple. "You're home," she whispered. Hans nodded, though part of him wasn't sure what home meant anymore. The first nights were sleepless. He lay awake listening to the distant hum of rebuilding, the clang of metal, the cough of engines. In the morning, he walked through the streets, joining neighbors as they cleared debris and salvaged materials. Work became his therapy, motion his medicine. The American occupation forces were present, distributing food and supplies. To Hans's surprise, the soldiers were not cruel. They helped, organized, and encouraged reconstruction. Many Germans, still proud but broken, struggled to accept help from their former enemies. But Hans understood. He had seen the other side. One afternoon, he volunteered to work at a warehouse run by American engineers. They were rebuilding the city's power grid. Hans's mechanical skills quickly drew attention, and soon he was repairing generators again, just as he had done in Kansas. When one of the Americans recognized his skill, he smiled. "You learned that over there, didn't you?"
Hans nodded.
"Yes," he said softly, "and I'm still learning." Day by day, Germany began to breathe again. Food lines grew shorter. Markets reopened. Schools gathered children among the ruins, teaching them new words: freedom, democracy, future. The transition was not easy. There were arguments, regrets, moments of despair. Many former soldiers faced suspicion or silence from their communities. Some carried shame too heavy to speak of. But amid that, there was also resilience, a quiet determination to start over. Hans spent his evenings writing letters to the friends he had left behind in America, to Robert Hayes, the farmer, to Father O'Donnell, the chaplain. In one letter he wrote, "You taught us not by preaching, but by living. What I saw in your country will shape the rest of my life." Years later, as West Germany began to rise from its ashes, its factories humming again, its cities glowing with new light, Hans often thought back to those early days after his return. The broken streets, the tired faces, the stubborn hope. He realized that the journey home had not ended when he stepped off the ship. It was still continuing, in every wall rebuilt, in every child sent to school, in every moment when Germans chose understanding over hate. One evening, standing on a bridge overlooking the rebuilt port of Hamburg, Hans watched the cranes swing over the water, lifting steel and stone for new construction. The sound was familiar, the hum of creation. He closed his eyes and remembered another place, across an ocean. The factories, the farms, the wide American sky. He smiled. The road home, he understood now, was not a single path. It was a journey through destruction, memory, and rediscovery. A journey that had taken him across the world to learn what truly mattered, and then brought him back to help rebuild it. And though his homeland was scarred, it was alive again, and so was he. Years had passed since Hans Becker returned to Germany. The war was now a memory, but its echoes lingered, in the ruins still being cleared, in the families still searching for missing names, and in the minds of men who had once worn the uniform of the Reich. Hans had rebuilt his life piece by piece. He worked in a factory that produced agricultural machinery, machines that plowed and harvested instead of destroyed. The irony was not lost on him. that the same hands which once maintained engines of war now turned soil for crops. Every morning, as he walked to work past rows of new houses rising from the ashes, he saw a different Germany taking shape. It was smaller, humbler, but also wiser. In the evenings, when the factory lights dimmed and the city grew quiet, Hans often found himself thinking back to the strange journey that had changed everything, to the years as a prisoner of war in America. At first, those memories had been like dreams, distant, softened by time. But as the new Germany grew, those years began to feel more important than ever. He remembered the day they first arrived in the United States. The disbelief at the size of the cities, the kindness of strangers, the sight of industries that seemed to move with purpose rather than oppression. He remembered conversations with American farmers who had lost sons in the same war that had taken his comrades, yet still offered him bread and dignity. Those moments had done more than feed his body. They had rebuilt his soul. Now, as Germany tried to find its place in a divided world, men like Hans became quiet bridges, connecting two nations that had once called each other enemies. In 1952, Hans received a letter from Kansas. It was from Robert Hayes, the farmer who had employed him during his captivity. The handwriting was shaky but warm. Hans, it read, "The wheat came in early this year. Every time I see the harvest, I think of the men who helped me back then. Men like you. The world was crazy, but somehow we found decency in the middle of it." Hans read the letter several times, smiling. He wrote back immediately. Their correspondence continued for years, growing into a friendship that survived across oceans and ideologies. He wasn't alone. Many former German POWs began writing to their American hosts. Some even returned to visit in the 1950s and 60s, standing once more on the soil where they had once been prisoners, now as free men and guests. It was one of history's quiet miracles. Enemies turned into friends, not through politics, but through shared humanity. Hans became part of a small but growing movement. Veterans who spoke at schools and town meetings, telling younger generations about the dangers of hate and the power of understanding. He told them about the camp fences, about the guards who treated them with fairness, about the shock of seeing factories filled with laughter instead of fear. Freedom, he would say, is not chaos, it's responsibility. It means building something better, together. Students listened, often wide-eyed. For them, the war was a story in textbooks. For Hans, it was a wound that had finally healed. In 1955, he was invited to a conference in Bonn, where former POWs discussed their experiences abroad. Some had been held in France, others in Britain, and many, like him, in America. What struck him was the pattern. The men who had spent time in the United States spoke differently. They carried a kind of quiet optimism, a belief that nations could rise from ruin without losing their humanity. During a coffee break, one man said to him, "You know, Hans, the Americans defeated us twice, once with their weapons and once with their kindness."
Hans nodded.
"Yes," he said, "and it's the second victory that lasts." Outside, the Rhine flowed calmly, reflecting the evening light. It reminded him of the Mississippi, of wide skies and endless plains. In that moment, the world felt smaller, as if the rivers of both continents were somehow connected. Over time, Hans's reflections deepened. He began writing essays for local newspapers, not about the battles he fought, but about the lessons he learned. He wrote of the value of democracy, of how strength built on fear will always collapse, while strength built on freedom endures. In one essay, he wrote, "The Americans did not try to re-educate us with lectures. They did it by example. They showed us a society that could be strong without being cruel, industrious without being enslaved, and proud without being blind." His words struck a chord. Many Germans were searching for meaning in the ruins of ideology, and voices like Hans's offered guidance. He was invited to speak in schools, then in universities, and later on the radio. When he talked about the past, he didn't hide the shame or the mistakes. He spoke of the arrogance that had blinded his generation, of how propaganda had twisted patriotism into poison. But he also spoke of redemption, the power to change when shown a different way. One evening in 1961, as news spread that Berlin was being divided by a wall, Hans felt a deep sadness. The world was splitting again, east and west, freedom and control. He feared that the lessons of their time as prisoners might be forgotten. But then he received another letter, this one from the son of an American guard he had known in the camp. The young man wrote that his father had often told stories about the German mechanic who never gave up hope. The letter ended with a simple line: "My father taught me to believe that even enemies can learn from each other." Hans placed the letter on his desk and stared at it for a long time. Outside, the city of Hamburg was alive again. Neon lights, trams, laughter in the streets. He realized that, despite the scars, the world had indeed learned something. As he grew older, Hans often walked to the harbor in the evenings. He liked to watch the ships leaving for America, their lights gliding across the dark water. Sometimes he imagined writing one more letter, a message to the young men of both nations. "Do not let flags make you blind," he would write. "Remember what we discovered behind the fences, that dignity, kindness, and respect can exist even between enemies, that understanding is stronger than hatred, and that the real victory is not in conquering others, but in conquering our own ignorance." He never sent that final letter, but its spirit lived in everything he did. When Hans Becker died in 1972, a small wooden box was found among his belongings. Inside were his POW identification tag, a faded photograph of the Kansas farm, and the letters he had exchanged with Robert Hayes. On top of them lay a small note, written in his careful script: "War made me a prisoner. Humanity made me free."